Hello everybody, Eternal Flame here, and oh boy, we're here to talk about one of the most recent JJK problems, because I feel like a lot of people are starting to have this problem of if Sukuna is just too much by this point, or if the glazing for Sukuna the narrator keeps offering, the JJK keeps offering them, is getting a little bit too much, and just overall, if Sukuna is right now just a massive problem for the narrative, and what all the arguments I've seen for, and then I'm ultimately going to give my opinion, as well as my own issues I have with Sukuna as well. I'm Eternal Flame, and let's get straight into this. So ultimately, the problems that I feel most people have with Sukuna you can put in one of four camps, which I'm going to go over all four of these camps today. The first camp is that the Sukuna fight feels like it has been going on for far too long, as right now the Sukuna fight is nearly twice the length of Mahito versus Yuji, which is incredible considering Mahito versus Yuji was over 10 chapters of battle, and Sukuna versus everybody has been even longer than that. The second issue that I feel a lot of people have is this feeling that Sukuna just has a lot of plot armor, or the counters for everybody, or just kind of feels like he has plot armor just in general. The third problem is kind of in the same boat as the second problem, but it's a little bit more focused, which is beating Sukuna feels impossible by this point because of everything that JJK has been establishing for him, and JJK just keeps establishing for him as the narrative continues. And the final part of this all is simply, Sukuna is just starting to bore people, because at this point, we haven't really gotten anything new from Sukuna, we haven't gotten any new powers from Sukuna, we haven't gotten any new ideas about his backstory. Sure, we had gotten an internal monologue, but that was about it. We don't really know that much about Sukuna just in general, not that much has changed about Sukuna. And there just hasn't been that much progression in the plot since where we started. So I'm going to go over each of these problems, go over my opinion on them, do I think that these problems are valid or not, and just overall, if Sukuna is a massive problem for the narrative or not. So the first problem that I do want to tackle is the Sukuna fight has been going on for far too long problem, and I kind of disagree with this being a massive problem for the narrative because of one simple fact. It's not like we're just consistently getting one character versus Sukuna for that entire period of time. The longest period of time that we got Sukuna versus one character was Sukuna versus Gojo, which Sukuna versus Gojo was not that long in comparison, and Sukuna versus Gojo was something that was incredibly hyped up for the longest time, where everyone wanted to see Sukuna versus Gojo, and there were a lot of people who were just straight up saying that JJK would be a bad series if Sukuna versus Gojo never happened and it was a necessary evil that needed to happen. Other than Sukuna versus Gojo and the salt that came with people not liking the fact that Gojo ultimately lost, most of the other battles are really not as long in comparison. If you're looking at it as just how long Sukuna has been fighting people, then yeah, you're gonna feel like it's been really long. But it needs to be remembered, Sukuna has been fighting people in a gauntlet up to this point. For example, Sukuna versus Higuruma was 2 chapters, Sukuna versus Yudo was 3 chapters, and Sukuna versus Kashimo was 2 chapters. Overall, those chapters end up adding up over time, and even Sukuna versus Yuji in their little 1v1 has been 1 chapter with Yuji assisting everybody. Of course, yes, this still adds up over time, but if you look at it as just Sukuna fighting everybody, it gets tiring. But if you look at it in a gauntlet style fight where every single time a new character enters into the fray and it doesn't last that long, it won't feel as long. Now, ultimately, this is more of a subjective than objective opinion, because if you do feel like it's still been too long, even with everything I have said directly, and a better way to look at it, that's up to you. I can't really change your view on this because this is a subjective problem and not an objective problem. I do also want to say that I think this is a problem that more so comes from reading it week to week, mainly because of the fact that we are having to wait literal months for this battle to be over, but once it's all done and in the dirt, we can just read it all and it won't take that much time, and you're going to really feel like that it just wasn't that long in comparison. So while I do think this is a valid issue to have with the entire Sukuna Gauntlet battle of feeling like it was too long, I do ultimately also don't agree with this issue, but that's more so because of how I view it, rather than just a simple thing of it objectively being a bad problem, because it's not. It's very valid just have the Sukuna fight being too long, in your opinion. As now we're going to move on to the second issue, which I believe this one is a lot more objective than the other one previously, which is the fact that it kind of feels like Sukuna has plot armor by this point. As in my opinion, there are only really 5 instances where it's up for debate if Sukuna actually does have plot armor or not. With those instances being Sukuna getting the space dismantled to begin with, Sukuna getting Kamutoke taken away instead of his cursed technique from Higuruma's domain expansion, Sukuna not getting stabbed by the executioner sword, Sukuna not losing his technique fully from Yuda's Jacob's ladder when it hit him, and Maki not off-guarding Sukuna when she had the perfect opportunity to off-guard Sukuna. Now I'm going to go over these instances of plot armor in reverse order, in order to discuss whether it's truly plot armor or not. Where the first one is Maki not off-guarding Sukuna, and this is pretty easy to say why. It's purely because they are not trying to kill Megumi in this moment, they are just trying to take Sukuna out of Megumi's body. If Maki were to take out Sukuna, then Megumi would also be dead because he wasn't freed by that point. So that is more so a misconception that I think people have about their plan. Ultimate goal is to make sure that Megumi is still alive, and if Maki were to take Sukuna out then, it would have taken out Megumi as well. Up next is Sukuna not losing his technique from Jacob's Ladder, and I think this is more so because people don't actually understand how Jacob's Ladder work and not actually plot armor. Because everyone has the misconception in their mind that Jacob's Ladder is an insta-work technique and it doesn't matter how powerful you are, it just turns off your technique, but that is very clearly not the case. Considering the fact that Yuta has to fire it off at max output, and Sukuna's entire plan was literally to let the attack hit him, it's more so it just weakened Sukuna and it would have eventually taken away his curse technique, rather than him actually just immediately instantly losing his curse technique. Same with why Sukuna wasn't immediately purged away. Because as we saw with 15-finger Meguna, it didn't immediately purge away Sukuna. It needed time to work, and it still does need time to work. It's not an insta-win GG no retype thing. Up next is the Sukuna not getting stabbed by the Executioner Sword, but this is more so I don't think anyone was expecting Sukuna to get stabbed by that sword. And even when Sukuna did get stabbed by that sword, he successfully worked around it and worked around it really, really intelligently, and that was more so a show of his intelligence rather than showing Sukuna has actual plot armor because he worked around it pretty well by cutting off the part of his body before it could actually stab him. Up next is Sukuna getting Kamutoke taken away from Higuruma's domain, and I'm going to be honest with you guys, I do consider this straight up plot armor. Not because Higuruma didn't take away his curse technique, because I've come to accept that and it was just more so we didn't know how Higuruma's curse technique actually worked, but more so them taking away Kamutoke because that was all Kamutoke existed to do. In order to be a MacGuffin for Sukuna to not lose his curse technique from Higuruma's domain, and I consider that plot armor. Now, while I do consider that would have been suitable enough damage, because, for example, if Kamutoke was inside of that domain, it would have been doing a lot more damage, especially considering the fact that Yuji can't exactly affect Kamutoke's output, because Kamutoke has nothing to do with Sukuna's curse energy output and his punches, then it would still be a massive game changer nonetheless. But also the fact that that was the only reason that Kamutoke did exist is the only reason I'm going to call Kamutoke being taken away, in particular, to be plot armor. Now, if Sukuna lost another curse like 10 Shadows instead, I wouldn't consider it plot armor, but I consider Kamutoke being taken away plot armor purely because that was the only reason Kamutoke ended up existing in the long run. And then there's finally Sukuna getting the Space Dismantle, which I do not consider plot armor at all. Now, no matter what your opinion on Sukuna versus Gojo is, whether you think Sukuna had more options and more ways to win inside of the domain expansion if he was trying to do that instead of adapt to Gojo, or if you think that Sukuna would have ultimately lost without the Space Dismantle and that was the only way, either way, it can't be ignored the fact that Sukuna had to put his life on the line several times and take so much damage repeatedly throughout the fight, while also sacrificing his ability to use the domain in the future parts of the next battle and having to put his domain and brain on cooldown just to get the Space Dismantle, while also losing Mahoraga directly, as well as losing his reincarnation thanks to how damaged he was in order for Kashimo to finish that part off, for Sukuna to be forced to reincarnate. No matter what, I ultimately do believe Sukuna earned getting the Space Dismantle, and I don't consider that plot armor because of how massively damaged that set him, and the fact that it's setting up so many opportunities for him to still lose in the future to his students. So ultimately, I do not think that Sukuna had plot armor for that as well, because of how much Sukuna had to put his life on the line, as well as the fact that it was established that Sukuna is able to copy abilities or basic applications of Jujutsu after just seeing them once, as directly stated by the Angel as well, that Sukuna was able to learn how to split his soul just after seeing Kenjaku and feeling Kenjaku do it to him once. So ultimately, I only consider one of these 5 instances plot armor, because these are the main 5 that I actually do see being considered plot armor, with the others either being misconceptions that people have, or just straight up Sukuna worked hard enough to get it. And I only consider the Kamutoke one plot armor because that's the only reason Kamutoke even comes to exist to begin with. So now we're going to move on to the third problem that a lot of people have, which is beating Sukuna feels impossible by this point because of everything Gege has established for him. And if there was one problem that I heavily agree with for Sukuna, it is this problem in particular. Now, originally, I didn't think this was a problem at all, mainly because of how much Gege had been working to make sure every character had a little bit of weakening done to Sukuna, and each character had their own impact to help the battle against Sukuna to get him closer and closer to death. With Gojo, for example, still having brain damage left to Sukuna, preventing him from using his domain, and forcing Sukuna to have to use half of his curse energy total. Kashimo, who finished the job against Meguna and forced him to reincarnate, making him use his one-time incarnation. Higuruma, who took away Kamutoke, who, while I do think Kamutoke was ultimately created to help Sukuna and make sure Sukuna didn't lose his curse technique, if Kamutoke was still around, and it would have been very, very bad news for the characters, purely because of the fact that Kamutoke would have done a lot of damage to a lot of characters. with no way to deal with it other than having to be forced to take the brunt of it, where even someone who was super resistant to lightning still took damage from it nonetheless, but it just wasn't much damage, but it still would have been super powerful against everybody else. Yuji, who has been heavily working to weaken Sukuna's output down to the point where Sukuna was not able to one-shot several of them other than with direct cleaves, and even then they could heal it off. Yuta Akotsu, who has worked to heavily damage him up to this point several times over, and Maki, who now landed her own blow that needs to be focused on to heal that Sukuna doesn't have the option to do while they fight Maki as well. Now, of course, I was very aware, and a lot of people are very aware of the fact that Sukuna is still holding back up to this point, which doesn't surprise a lot of people, but it was seeming like more and more that Gege was going to make it so the fact that Sukuna was holding back was going to be his ultimate flaw, and what has gotten him down to this point, which is still the case right now. If Sukuna wasn't holding back from the start, none of this would have happened. After the battle against Gojo, if Sukuna stopped holding back, everyone here would be dead, and he never would have been this close to death. But the most recent chapter has kinda just established something, which is the fact that Sukuna still holding back is actually a massive problem, because as the battle continues, he starts to get more and more bored with the battle, and it's pretty clear Sukuna's about to stop holding back as well, because as Urame directly says themselves, they should be ashamed that they couldn't bring them anyone greater than Satoru Gojo, and that Sukuna is starting to get bored with the battles. Now, I do think he has been enjoying the battles up to this point, but I do think he is also starting to get a bit bored with all of the fighting, because none of them are really strong like Satoru Gojo was. So it's becoming more and more difficult in people's minds to accept that Sukuna could be defeated, purely because of the fact that Gege keeps establishing Sukuna as this unstoppable, unparalleled force, down to the point where it's starting to become annoying for a lot of fans from what I can see, which I do understand why it would be annoying, because Sukuna does just feel impossible to stop, and I don't think a lot of people are going to end up liking it if Sukuna ends up being defeated to begin with. Now, there are a camp of people who fully want Sukuna to win in the end, which I completely disagree with, and that's an entire different video for an entirely different day, so if you are part of that camp, just ignore this part entirely, but that's an entirely different discussion. But I do ultimately think that the pedestal that Gege is holding Sukuna in up to this point is starting to become a little bit of a problem, if I'm being completely honest, and I think a lot of people are also starting to view it as a problem as well. That Sukuna is this completely unstoppable force, which is going to feel incredibly difficult to justify how Sukuna ends up losing in the end to any of them, because it also kind of feels like after this chapter that someone needs to surpass Gojo just based on Urame's wording of that statement. However, that's just my opinion, and that's also another video idea for another day, because I don't want to discuss that, because that is actually just straight up the length of an entire video discussion for me. As now we're going to get into the final section of this and the final problem that people have, which is Sukuna is starting to bore people. And if I'm being completely honest, this one is an extremely understandable problem, but this is also one of the most subjective problems there is, because it's all dependent on your villain preference. For example, I like Sukuna a lot more than I like Kenjaku, but I also know a lot of people like Kenjaku a lot more, and a lot of people wanted Kenjaku to be the final villain and not Sukuna. Which is why a lot of people were also cheering for Gojo to win the battle, because there were basically two camps of people who wanted Gojo to win, which Camp A were basically the Gojo fans, and Camp B were the people who wanted Kenjaku to be the final villain. And at least in my opinion, I do actually think Kenjaku is dead. I know there are some people who think that Kenjaku isn't dead, but that hope is kind of wavering by this point for a lot of people, especially with the fact that Sukuna is now in charge of the merger. But overall, I do think this is ultimately just a much more subjective problem that I can't really comment on, but it's one I completely understand if you are bored of Sukuna by this point, because I think you are completely justified of being bored of Sukuna, because if Sukuna is not your cup of tea, then he's not your cup of tea, and seeing him battle against this many people and his battle continue this long is understandable. The other issue of being bored of Sukuna I do agree with as well, which is the fact that we haven't really seen anything new come from Sukuna up to this point, because I think a lot more people would be less bored of Sukuna if we were starting to see new things, because up until this point he has only really used Cleave and Dismantle, despite the fact that we are aware that he has more in his arsenal. I think more things would be going along and it would feel a lot less slow if we were actually starting to see more of what Sukuna had to offer, rather than just use Cleave, Dismantle, and the new Space Dismantle that a lot of people really don't like. But overall, this is like the main issue that I think people have with him, that we haven't seen much of Sukuna, and just Sukuna's kind of been stagnant, and we just don't really know much more about Sukuna. So in my opinion, it's not that most people are bored of Sukuna, but it's more so the problem of most people are bored of us staying at the same place with Sukuna and not really figuring out anything new about Sukuna up until this point. However, I want to hear what you guys think of the comment section down below of the Sukuna problem. Are there more problems with Sukuna that I didn't actually cover in this video? Because I feel like there might be more that I'm not exactly thinking of in the current moment, and these are just the main ones I can think of off the top of my head, but you guys probably have other ones that I might make a second video talking about this. I'm not entirely sure, but overall, this is mainly what I think about the Sukuna problem. So, I'm gonna see y'all later. Peace out. Have a good day.